The summer heat in Florida doesn't just disappear when the sun goes down. It lingers in the air, thick and heavy, making everything feel slower than it should. That's how it was on that August evening in Bradford County, a quiet rural area northeast of Gainesville, where not much happens and people like it that way. Ebony was driving home with her 3 kids in the back seat. Her oldest daughter was 10, and the 2 younger ones were still at that age where a car ride after dark meant sleepy eyes and yawning. They had been out running errands, nothing special, just the kind of everyday stuff that fills up a mother's schedule. Groceries. A quick stop at the pharmacy. Maybe some gas for the car. She was 4 months pregnant with her 4th child. The kind of pregnant where you're past the scary first trimester but not yet big enough to feel uncomfortable behind the wheel. She felt good that night. Tired, sure, but the good kind of tired that comes from taking care of your family. The road she was on was dark. Really dark. Out in rural Florida, once you leave the main highways, the streetlights disappear and you're left with nothing but your headlights cutting through the blackness. Trees line both sides of the road like silent guards, and you could drive for miles without seeing another car. Ebony wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Maybe she was thinking about what to make for dinner tomorrow. Maybe she was thinking about the baby growing inside her and wondering if it would be a boy or a girl. Maybe she was just enjoying the quiet moment before getting home and starting the bedtime routine with 3 tired kids. That's when she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, blue and red, flashing in that pattern that makes your stomach drop even when you haven't done anything wrong. Every driver knows that feeling. That sudden rush of questions. Was I speeding? Did I run a stop sign? Is my taillight out? She pulled over right away like you're supposed to. Found a spot on the shoulder where the gravel crunched under her tires. Put the car in park. Turned off the engine. Took a breath. In the back seat, her 10-year-old daughter sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. The younger kids stirred but didn't fully wake up. It was just a traffic stop after all. Nothing to worry about. The officer would walk up, ask for license and registration, maybe write a ticket, and they'd be on their way. That's how these things work. Except that's not how this one worked. The deputy who approached her car didn't walk like someone about to write a speeding ticket. There was something in his body language, something aggressive and tense, that made Ebony's instincts start whispering warnings. She couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but she could see his hand. And his hand was moving toward his weapon. Her heart started beating faster. Not the normal nervousness of a traffic stop. Something deeper. Something primal. The kind of fear that mothers feel when they sense danger near their children. She rolled down her window, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel, just like she had always been taught. Be polite, be cooperative. Don't give anyone a reason to escalate things. These were the rules she had learned growing up. The unwritten instructions for how to survive an encounter with law enforcement, but before she could even say hello, before she could ask what she had done wrong, the deputy's gun was out of its holster and it was pointed directly at her. Time does strange things in moments like that. Some people say it speeds up, becomes a blur of panic and confusion. For Ebony, it slowed down. Every detail became sharp and clear. The weight of the gun in the officer's hands. The sound of her daughter gasping in the back seat. The feel of her unborn baby shifting inside her, as if the child could somehow sense the danger surrounding them. Get out of the vehicle. The deputy's voice was loud, commanding, filled with an intensity that didn't match the situation at all. This was a traffic stop on a quiet road. A pregnant woman with kids in the car. What could possibly justify this response? Ebony's mind raced through possibilities. Had there been a crime in the area? Did her car match some description? Was this a case of mistaken identity? None of it made sense. She was a pastor's wife, for heaven's sake. She taught Sunday school. She volunteered at community events. She had never been in trouble with the law in her entire life, but none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the gun pointed at her face and the children crying behind her. "Officer, please," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm pregnant. My children are in the car." She said it hoping it would change something. hoping that the mention of her pregnancy, the presence of her kids, would flip some switch in the deputy's mind and make him realize that whatever he thought was happening, he was wrong. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't dangerous. She was just a mom trying to get her family home safely. The deputy didn't lower his weapon in the back seat. Her 10-year-old daughter had gone from scared to terrified. The little girl had seen enough news stories, heard enough conversations between adults, to understand that moments like this sometimes ended in tragedy. She had seen the videos that went viral. She knew that people who looked like her family sometimes didn't survive encounters like this one. So she did something that no child should ever have to do. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Her hands were shaking so badly that the footage would later come out shaky and hard to watch. But she kept recording anyway, some instinct telling her that if something terrible happened, there needed to be proof. There needed to be evidence. The world needed to see. Ebony didn't know her daughter was recording. She was too focused on the gun, too focused on staying calm, too focused on doing everything exactly right so that she could survive this moment and get her children home safely. "Step out of the vehicle now." The deputy's commands kept coming, each one louder and more aggressive than the last. Slowly, carefully, Ebony opened her car door. She moved like someone walking through a minefield, aware that any wrong step could be her last. Her pregnant belly made it harder to move gracefully, but she did her best, keeping her hands visible at all times, narrating her movements so there would be no confusion. "I'm stepping out now," she said. "My hands are empty. I'm not resisting." The gravel crunched under her feet as she stood on the side of the road. The night air was still warm, but she felt cold. The kind of cold that comes from fear, from adrenaline, from the knowledge that your life is in someone else's hands and there's nothing you can do about it. Behind her, she could hear her children crying. Her daughter was saying something, maybe praying, maybe just talking to herself to stay calm. The younger ones didn't understand what was happening, but they could feel the terror in the air. Kids always know when something is wrong. Even if they can't name it, the deputy ordered her to get on her knees, a pregnant woman. 4 months along, being ordered to kneel on the gravel beside a dark road while a gun stayed trained on her body. She complied. What choice did she have? The rocks bit into her knees as she lowered herself down. She thought about her baby, wondered if the stress was hurting the little life growing inside her. She thought about her other children, watching their mother be treated like a criminal through the car windows. She thought about her husband at home, probably wondering why they were taking so long to get back, and then she felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around her wrists. The click of those handcuffs was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt with her hands bound behind her back and her children screaming, Ebony had no idea that this night would change everything. She had no idea that her daughter's shaky phone video would be seen by millions. She had no idea that her husband's response to what happened would make national news. All she knew was that she had done nothing wrong. And somehow she had ended up here. The night was far from over. And the story was just beginning. The gravel was digging into her knees. Small, sharp rocks pressing into her skin through the thin fabric of her clothes. But Ebony barely noticed the physical pain. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, split between the gun still pointed in her direction and the sounds of her children crying inside the car. She had never felt so helpless in her entire life. Here she was. A grown woman, a mother of 3 with another on the way, kneeling on the side of a dark road like some kind of criminal. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, the metal digging into her wrists every time she shifted even slightly. And for what? She still didn't even know what she had done wrong. The deputy was talking into his radio, calling for backup as if he had just pulled over someone dangerous. As if she was some kind of threat? The words he was using didn't match reality at all. She was a pregnant woman in a minivan with kids in the back seat. What kind of threat could she possibly be? Inside the car, her 10-year-old daughter was still recording. The little girl's hands were trembling so badly that she had to grip the phone with both hands just to keep it steady. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't make a sound. She just kept the camera pointed at the window, capturing everything she could see through the glass. Later, when people asked her why she started recording, she would struggle to explain it. It wasn't something she thought about. It wasn't a decision she made consciously. It was pure instinct, something deep inside her that said this moment needed to be documented. This moment needed witnesses, even if those witnesses were just the millions of strangers who might someday watch the video on their phones. The younger children didn't understand what was happening. They just knew their mother was outside the car and she wasn't coming back in, and there were flashing lights everywhere and everyone was upset. One of them kept calling out for Mommy, the word muffled through the closed windows but still clear enough to break Ebony's heart over and over again. She wanted to call back to them. She wanted to tell them everything was going to be okay. But she didn't dare speak without permission. She didn't dare move without being told to move. Every cell in her body was focused on one single goal, getting through this moment alive. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Another patrol car arrived, then another. Soon there were multiple officers standing around, talking to each other in low voices, occasionally glancing over at the pregnant woman kneeling in the dirt like she was some kind of curiosity. None of them helped her up. None of them offered her water or asked if she was okay. None of them seemed to care that she was visibly pregnant. That kneeling on rough ground couldn't possibly be good for her or the baby. Ebony's legs were starting to go numb. The position was uncomfortable under normal circumstances, but at 4 months pregnant, it was becoming genuinely painful. She could feel pressure building in her lower back, a dull ache that made her worry about the life growing inside her. "Please," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I at least stand up? I'm pregnant. This position is really hurting me." The deputy who had pulled her over looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his expression in the darkness, couldn't tell if he felt any remorse for what he was putting her through. Finally, he gave a short nod and one of the other officers helped her to her feet. Standing was better, but not by much. Her hands were still cuffed behind her back, which made her balance unsteady. She had to lean against the side of her car just to keep from swaying. Through the window, she could see her daughter's face, pale and tear-streaked, still holding up that phone. Their eyes met for just a second. Mother and daughter, separated by a pane of glass and a nightmare neither of them had seen coming. Ebony tried to smile, tried to send some kind of reassurance through that brief moment of eye contact, but she couldn't quite manage it. How do you reassure your child when you're standing in handcuffs and you don't know what's going to happen next? The officers were still talking among themselves. Ebony caught fragments of their conversation, words like speeding and protocol and procedure. Speeding. That's what all of this was about. She had been driving a little too fast on a dark rural road, and somehow that had led to guns being drawn and handcuffs being locked and her children being traumatized in ways that might take years to heal. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. She thought about her husband back at home. He was probably starting to worry by now. They should have been back an hour ago, maybe more. Was he pacing around the kitchen, checking his phone every few minutes? Was he thinking about calling her to ask where they were? She wished she could reach him somehow, let him know what was happening. Ask him to come help, but her phone was in her purse, and her purse was in the car, and she couldn't exactly reach for it with her hands locked behind her back. Time kept moving in that strange, distorted way. At some point, one of the officers finally approached her with something that almost looked like embarrassment on his face. He uncuffed her wrists, and the relief was so immediate and so overwhelming that she almost cried, but she held it together. She had been holding it together this whole time, and she wasn't going to break now. Not in front of these men who had treated her like a criminal. Not while her children were watching. They gave her a speeding ticket. A piece of paper with a fine written on it, handed over like nothing unusual had happened. Like she hadn't just spent the last half hour fearing for her life. Like her children hadn't just witnessed their mother at gunpoint. "You're free to go," the deputy said. "Free to go." As if she had ever been anything other than free? As if she had done something that justified taking away her freedom in the first place. Ebony took the ticket without a word. Her hands were shaking as she folded it and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't trust herself to speak. If she opened her mouth, she wasn't sure what would come out. Anger, maybe. Or grief. Or something in between that didn't have a name. She got back into her car slowly, carefully like someone moving through a dream. Her daughter immediately leaned forward from the back seat, wrapping her arms around the headrest in a clumsy attempt at a hug. "Mama, are you okay?" "Mama?" The younger children were crying openly now, confused and scared and desperate for comfort. Ebony wanted to comfort them. She wanted to pull over and hold each of them and tell them that everything was fine, that it was all over, that they were safe. But she couldn't stop yet. She needed to get away from this place first. She needed to put some distance between her family and those flashing lights, that deputy, that stretch of road that would probably haunt her dreams for years to come. She started the engine with trembling hands, pulled back onto the road, drove toward home at exactly the speed limit, not a mile over, her eyes constantly flickering to the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following them, the whole drive home. Her daughter kept the video open on her phone. She didn't watch it, couldn't bring herself to watch it yet, but she held on to it like a lifeline, like proof that what had happened was real and not just some horrible nightmare. When they finally pulled into their driveway, when Ebony finally put the car in park and turned off the engine, she allowed herself one moment of weakness. Just one. She put her head down on the steering wheel and let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a sigh. Then she straightened up, wiped her eyes, and prepared to face her husband. She had no idea how she was going to explain what had just happened. She had no idea how they were going to move forward from this. All she knew was that something had broken inside her tonight, some sense of safety and trust that she might never get back. The front door opened, and there he was. Her husband, backlit by the warm glow of their home, his face shifting from relief to confusion to concern as he took in the scene before him. "Baby? What's wrong? What happened?" Ebony opened her mouth to answer, but it was her daughter who spoke first. Still clutching her phone, still trembling from head to toe, the 10-year-old said the words that would change everything. "Daddy, they put a gun on Mama. They put her in handcuffs. I got it all on video." And just like that, the story entered its next chapter. Pastor Washington stood in the doorway of his home, trying to make sense of the words his daughter had just spoken. A gun handcuffs his wife, his pregnant wife. The sentences didn't fit together in any way that made sense. He looked past his daughter to Ebony, still sitting in the driver's seat with her hands gripping the steering wheel like she was afraid to let go. Even from the doorway, he could see that something was deeply wrong. Her shoulders were hunched. Her face was turned away. She looked smaller somehow, like the night had taken something from her that he couldn't quite name. "What do you mean they put a gun on her?" His voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable even to himself. "Who put a gun on her?" His daughter held up her phone with a shaking hand. "A police officer, Daddy. I recorded it." "I recorded the whole thing." The next few minutes were a blur of movement and emotion. Getting Ebony out of the car, getting the kids inside, sitting everyone down in the living room while his wife finally, haltingly, told them what had happened on that dark stretch of road. With every word she spoke, Pastor Washington felt something building inside his chest. It started as disbelief, then shifted into confusion, and finally settled into something that burned hot and fierce: anger. The kind of anger that makes your hands shake and your vision narrow. The kind of anger that comes from seeing someone you love treated like they don't matter, but he didn't let it show. Not yet. Not while his children were watching, their eyes wide and fearful, still processing the trauma of what they had witnessed. Right now, they needed their father to be calm. They needed to feel safe in their own home. "Okay," he said slowly, pulling Ebony into his arms. "Okay, you're home now. You're safe. We're going to figure this out." She melted into him, and for the first time since the traffic stop, she let herself cry. Not loud, heaving sobs, but quiet tears that soaked into his shirt as he held her. Her whole body was trembling, the delayed shock finally catching up with her now that she was somewhere safe. The kids gathered around them, the younger ones clinging to their mother's legs. the oldest standing just off to the side with that phone still clutched in her hand. They stayed like that for a long time, a family holding on to each other in the middle of their living room, trying to make sense of something senseless. Later, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Pastor Washington sat down to watch the video. His daughter had handed over the phone without a word, and he had taken it to his study, closing the door behind him. He needed to see this alone first. He needed to understand exactly what had happened before he decided what to do next. The footage was shaky, just like his daughter had warned him. The image bounced and blurred as her small hands trembled behind the camera. But the audio was clear enough. He could hear the deputy shouting commands. He could hear his wife's voice, steady and calm even though she must have been terrified. He could hear his younger children crying in the background, confused and scared, and then he saw it. The moment the deputy drew his weapon and pointed it at Ebony through the car window, Pastor Washington had to pause the video. He sat back in his chair and pressed his hands against his eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to control the storm of emotions raging inside him. His wife, the mother of his children, the woman carrying his unborn baby, she had been standing there with a gun aimed at her head, and there was nothing he could have done to protect her. He thought about all the times they had talked about situations like this. The conversations that every family like theirs had to have, the instructions and warnings and prayers that were supposed to keep them safe. Be polite, be cooperative. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Don't argue. Don't resist. Ebony had done everything right. She had followed every single rule, spoken in a calm voice, moved slowly and deliberately. And it hadn't mattered. The deputy had still drawn his weapon, had still forced her to kneel in the dirt, had still put handcuffs on a pregnant woman over a speeding ticket. What was the point of playing by the rules if the rules could be ignored, whenever someone with a badge decided they didn't apply? Pastor Washington finished watching the video. Then he watched it again. And again. Each time he noticed new details. The way the deputy's hand had stayed on his weapon even after Ebony was out of the car. The way the other officers had stood around doing nothing while a pregnant woman knelt on the ground. The way no one had shown any concern for her well-being, or the well-being of the children watching from inside the vehicle. By the time he finally put the phone down, dawn was starting to break outside his window. He hadn't slept at all, but his mind was clearer than it had been in hours. He knew what he had to do. Some men, in his position, might have wanted revenge, might have wanted to find that deputy and make him pay for what he had done. Pastor Washington understood that impulse. He felt it pulling at him, whispering that justice meant meeting violence with violence, that the only way to make things right was to make someone suffer. But he was a man of faith, a man who had spent his life preaching about love and forgiveness and the power of doing good in the face of evil. And more than that, he was a father. His children were watching him. They would learn from how he handled this moment, and what they learned would shape who they became. So he made a choice. Instead of seeking revenge, he would seek accountability. Instead of responding with anger, he would respond with purpose. He would make sure that what happened to his wife was seen by everyone, and he would demand that the system that allowed it to happen be changed. He started by making phone calls. First to a lawyer, someone who specialized in civil rights cases and would know how to navigate the legal system. Then to local community leaders, people who had influence and could help amplify their story. Then to journalists, reporters who covered stories like this and could bring attention to what had happened. With each call, he told the same story. His wife, 4 months pregnant, pulled over for speeding. The deputy who drew his weapon for no reason. The handcuffs. The children watching through the window. The 10-year-old daughter who had the presence of mind to record everything on her phone. People listened. They asked questions. They expressed shock and outrage. And slowly, a plan began to take shape. That evening, Pastor Washington sat down with Ebony and told her what he wanted to do. He wanted to share the video publicly. He wanted to file a formal complaint. He wanted to pursue every legal avenue available to ensure that the deputy who did this would face consequences. But it's your decision, he said, taking her hands in his. You're the one who went through this. If you want to keep it private, if you want to just move on and try to forget, I will support that. Whatever you need." Ebony was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face, then over at the doorway where their daughter was standing, pretending not to listen. "I keep thinking about other women," she finally said. "Other mothers? If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. What if next time there's no video? What if next time someone doesn't stay calm? What if next time—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They both knew what she meant. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," Ebony continued. "And I don't want our kids to grow up thinking that this is just how things are, that this is normal and acceptable and there's nothing you can do about it." She squeezed his hands tightly. "Share the video. Tell our story. Do whatever you have to do." Pastor Washington nodded slowly. He felt the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders, the responsibility of what they were about to undertake. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be pushback and criticism and people who tried to twist the story or blame Ebony for what happened. There would be long days and sleepless nights and moments when they wondered if any of it was making a difference, but they would face it together. As a family, he stood up, pulled out his phone, and began composing a message. By morning, the video would be online. By afternoon, it would be spreading across social media. And by the end of the week, their quiet family in rural Florida would find themselves at the center of a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the treatment of innocent people by those sworn to protect them. The deputy who had pointed a gun at his pregnant wife had no idea what was coming, neither did the rest of the world. The video went up on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had been shared thousands of times. By Wednesday, it was everywhere. Pastor Washington watched it spread with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He had known the footage was powerful. He had known it would get people's attention. But he hadn't been prepared for just how fast it would travel, jumping from one social media platform to another, picked up by news outlets, discussed on radio shows, debated in comment sections across the internet. His phone started ringing and didn't stop. Reporters wanted interviews, lawyers wanted to offer their services, community activists wanted to organize protests. Old friends he hadn't heard from in years called just to say they had seen the video and couldn't believe what had happened. Through it all, Ebony stayed mostly quiet. She wasn't ready to speak publicly yet, wasn't ready to relive those terrifying minutes over and over again for cameras and microphones. Pastor Washington understood. He became her voice, her shield, stepping in front of the media so she could stay protected behind him. The interview requests piled up. Local news first, then regional, then national. Everyone wanted to hear from the family at the center of the story that was suddenly on everyone's lips. Pastor Washington agreed to speak with a major network. He put on his best suit, the one he wore for Easter services and weddings. He sat in a chair in his living room while a camera crew set up lights and microphones. And when the interviewer asked him to describe what had happened to his wife, he spoke clearly and calmly, just like he did every Sunday from the pulpit. "She was treated as though she said she was a terrorist," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My wife is 4 months pregnant. She had our 3 children in the car with her. And a deputy pointed a gun at her head over a speeding ticket." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Our 10-year-old daughter watched a man point a gun at her mother. She thought she was going to watch her mother die. What kind of trauma does that leave on a child? What kind of world are we living in where a routine traffic stop can turn into something like this?" The interviewer asked what he wanted to happen next. What outcome was he hoping for? Pastor Washington had thought about this question a lot. He had prayed about it, discussed it with Ebony late into the night, turned it over in his mind during those quiet moments when the phone wasn't ringing and the house was still. "I want accountability," he said. "I want the officer who did this to face real consequences for his actions. But more than that, I want change. I don't want this to happen to another family. I don't want another mother to kneel in the dirt with her hands behind her back while her children watch. I don't want another child to have to record their parent being humiliated and threatened." He leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the camera. "We are not asking for vengeance. We are asking for justice. There's a difference." The interview aired that night during prime time. Millions of people watched. And the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with support for the Washington family. Hashtags trended, celebrities shared the video. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the deputy's actions. The story wasn't just local news anymore, it was national. It was everywhere. But not everyone was sympathetic. There were people who tried to find reasons to blame Ebony. They dug through her social media, looking for anything that might make her look bad. They questioned why she hadn't just stayed calm, even though the video clearly showed her staying completely calm. They made excuses for the deputy, suggesting that he must have had a reason for drawing his weapon, that there must be more to the story. Pastor Washington had expected this. He had warned Ebony that it would happen, that going public meant opening themselves up to criticism and attacks from strangers who had never met them and knew nothing about their lives. It still hurt to see. It still made his stomach turn when he read the hateful comments. But he didn't let it shake his resolve. The truth was on their side. The video showed exactly what happened, and no amount of spin or speculation could change that. Meanwhile, the Bradford County Sheriff's Department was facing intense pressure. The sheriff himself had seen the video, and unlike the deputy who had created this mess, he recognized immediately how badly his department had failed. Sheriff Gordon Smith called a press conference. He stood at a podium with the department's logo behind him, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. His face looked tired, worn down by days of controversy and criticism. "I have reviewed the footage from both the civilian recording and the deputy's body camera," he said. "And I want to be very clear about what I saw. Mrs. Washington did everything right. She was cooperative. She was calm. She posed no threat whatsoever." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. "I am hurt and disappointed that this happened in my county, under my watch. The actions of the deputy were wrong. They were disproportionate to the situation, and they traumatized an innocent family who deserved to be treated with respect and dignity." The questions came flying at him. What would happen to the deputy? Would there be charges? What was the department going to do to make sure this never happened again? The sheriff held up his hand for quiet. "The deputy in question has resigned from his position, effective immediately. We will be conducting a full internal review of our policies and procedures, and I will be reaching out to the Washington family personally to apologize for what they experienced." Resigned. The word spread through the crowd of reporters and out into the world. The deputy had resigned before he could be fired. It wasn't everything the family had hoped for, but it was something. It was a step. When Pastor Washington heard the news, he was standing in his kitchen making coffee. His phone buzzed with a text from their lawyer, and he read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. The deputy was gone. He set down his coffee cup and walked to the bedroom where Ebony was resting. She had been exhausted lately, the combination of pregnancy and stress taking a visible toll on her body. He sat down on the edge of the bed and touched her shoulder gently. "Baby, wake up. I have news." She opened her eyes slowly, still half asleep. "What is it?" He resigned. "The deputy who did this to you, he's gone?" Ebony was quiet for a long moment. He watched emotions flicker across her face, too many to name. Relief, maybe? Satisfaction? But also something sadder, something that recognized this wasn't really a victory. A man losing his job didn't undo what had been done. It didn't erase the nightmares their daughter was having. It didn't take away the fear that had settled into their family like an unwanted guest. "Good," she finally said. "That's good." But they both knew it wasn't enough. A resignation was just the beginning. Real change, lasting change, would take much more than one deputy losing his badge. Pastor Washington pulled out his phone and started scrolling through the messages that had been pouring in all week. Interview requests, speaking invitations, opportunities to share their story with bigger and bigger audiences. "What do you think?" he asked Ebony. "Do we keep going, or do we step back now that he's gone?" She didn't hesitate. "We keep going. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about everyone who's ever been treated like I was treated. Everyone who's been afraid and alone and wondering if anyone would believe them." She sat up slowly, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. "We have a platform now. People are listening. We'd be fools to waste that." Pastor Washington smiled, pride swelling in his chest. This woman, this incredible, strong, brave woman, she had been through something terrible, and instead of hiding from it, she was ready to use it to help others. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. "And we keep going," he said, "together." Outside, the sun was setting over Bradford County. Somewhere, a former deputy was packing up his desk. Somewhere, reporters were writing stories about accountability and justice. And in a small house on a quiet street, a family was preparing to take the next step in a journey they had never asked for but were determined to see through. The story had captured the nation's attention, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The months that followed were nothing like anything the Washington family had ever experienced. Their quiet life in rural Florida had been turned completely upside down, and there was no going back to the way things were before. Pastor Washington found himself traveling more than he ever had in his life. He spoke at churches and community centers, at conferences and town halls, at any venue that would have him. He told their story over and over again, not because he enjoyed reliving it, but because every time he shared it, he saw something change in the eyes of the people listening. Some of them cried. Some of them nodded along, recognizing pieces of their own experiences in his words. Some of them came up to him afterward and shared their own stories. Encounters they had never told anyone about. Moments of fear and humiliation that they had carried alone for years. "You're not alone," Pastor Washington would tell them. "What happened to you matters. Your story matters." Ebony eventually started speaking publicly too. It took her longer to get there, longer to feel ready to stand in front of strangers and talk about the worst night of her life. But when she finally did, her voice carried a power that moved people in ways that surprised even her. She talked about what it felt like to have a gun pointed at her while her children watched. She talked about the helplessness, the terror, the way time seemed to slow down until every second felt like an hour. She talked about the aftermath, the nightmares, the way she sometimes still flinched when she saw flashing lights in her rearview mirror, but she also talked about hope, about the possibility of change, about her belief that telling her story could help prevent other families from going through what hers had endured. "I did everything right that night," she would say. "I was calm. I was polite. I followed every instruction, and none of it mattered. That's why we need change. Not just in one department, not just in one county, but everywhere. The rules only work if they're applied fairly to everyone." Their daughter, the brave 10-year-old who had recorded the video, became something of a symbol herself. News stories called her courageous. Activists pointed to her as an example of young people taking action. She didn't fully understand all the attention, didn't know how to process being called a hero for doing something that had felt like pure instinct in the moment. Her parents tried to shield her from the spotlight as much as possible. She was still just a kid after all. She still needed to go to school and do her homework and play with her friends. But the experience had changed her in ways that were hard to put into words. She had grown up faster than any child should have to. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes always do. The family's attorney filed complaints and pursued every avenue available. Bradford County implemented new training protocols for traffic stops, with an emphasis on de-escalation techniques. Other departments in Florida and beyond took notice, some of them quietly reviewing their own policies to make sure something similar couldn't happen under their watch. It wasn't the sweeping revolution that some people had hoped for. Change rarely comes all at once, rarely arrives in a single dramatic moment. It comes in small steps, in policy adjustments and training updates and conversations that shift the culture inch by inch, but it was something. It was progress. And the Washington family could see their fingerprints on it. Winter turned to spring, and spring brought something the family had been waiting for through all the chaos and upheaval. Ebony's due date was approaching. The pregnancy had been harder than her previous ones. The stress of everything that had happened, the travel and speaking engagements and constant media attention had taken a toll on her body. Her doctor had put her on bed rest for the final weeks, ordering her to slow down and focus on nothing but bringing her baby safely into the world. Pastor Washington canceled all his upcoming appearances. For the first time in months, the family stayed home. The phone calls and interview requests were put on hold. The crusade for justice could wait. Right now, what mattered most was the new life about to join their family. The baby came on a warm April morning, arriving after a labor that was long but uncomplicated. A healthy girl with 10 fingers and 10 toes and a cry that filled the hospital room with the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. Pastor Washington held his newborn daughter for the first time, and the tears came before he could stop them. He thought about that night on the dark road. He thought about the gun pointed at his wife, at the belly that had held this precious child. He thought about how close they had come to losing everything, and then he thought about how far they had come since then. "She's perfect," he whispered. Looking at Ebony, "She's absolutely perfect." Ebony smiled, exhausted but radiant, reaching out to touch their daughter's tiny hand. "She's a fighter, just like her mama." The older children crowded around, eager to meet their new sister. The 10-year-old, who had been through so much and grown up so fast, looked at the baby with something like wonder on her face. "Can I hold her?" she asked. Her father carefully transferred the newborn into her arms, showing her how to support the head, how to hold the tiny body securely. The girl looked down at her baby sister with an expression that was far too old for her years. "I'm going to protect you," she whispered. "I'm going to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you." Pastor Washington put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. He didn't have the heart to tell her that you can't always protect the people you love, that sometimes bad things happen no matter how careful you are, no matter how many rules you follow, but he also knew something else. He knew that you can fight back. You can speak up. You can take the worst moment of your life and turn it into something that helps others. You can refuse to let injustice have the last word. That's what their family had done. That's what they would keep doing. A few weeks later, when Ebony was feeling stronger, a reporter came to their home for one final interview. It was meant to be a follow-up piece. A "where are they now?" story to update viewers on the family that had captured the nation's attention, the reporter asked Pastor Washington what he wanted people to remember about their story. What message did he hope would stay with people long after the headlines faded and the news cycle moved on to something else? He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I want people to remember that we had a choice," he said. "When this happened to my wife, we could have stayed silent. We could have taken that speeding ticket and gone home and tried to forget about it. A lot of families do that. They're tired. They're scared. They don't think anyone will believe them or care." He glanced over at Ebony, who was sitting beside him with their newborn daughter sleeping in her arms. But silence is how injustice survives. It feeds on people being too afraid or too exhausted to speak up. We decided that we weren't going to be silent. We were going to use our voices, our story, to try to make things better. He turned back to the reporter. "I don't know if we change the world. That's probably too big a thing to hope for. But maybe we change something for someone. Maybe some police officer somewhere saw our story and thought twice before drawing his weapon. Maybe some mother somewhere felt less alone because she knew we had been through something similar. Maybe that's enough." The reporter asked one more question. After everything they had been through, did they have any regrets about going public? Pastor Washington smiled and shook his head. "Not one," he said. "Not a single one." Outside the window, the Florida sun was shining bright and warm. Inside, a family that had been through fire sat together, whole and unbroken, ready for whatever came next. Their story had shocked the nation. The husband's response had indeed left everyone speechless. But in the end, it wasn't about shock or speechlessness. It was about love. It was about courage. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the moment demanded it, and that's a story worth telling. Again and again, for as long as it takes.